This is Glock G48 versus Stacatto C 2011 9mm. An unfair comparison? Let's hit the range. It was another beautiful day at banner shooting range, so you're going to have to contend with some background noise again. We have done a first range report on both the Stacatto C 2011 as well as the G48 in the past, so we are going to just go over the similarities and differences in this video. Now let's talk about the differences first. This is for all the people who think we should probably compare salt and pepper next. The Stacatto C is a single action only pistol that is based on the 1911. It's considered a 2011 firearm. The Glock G48 is in the slimline family of pistols. That is a striker-fired pistol chambered in 9mm. It is also single stack like the Stacatto C. The Glock has a polymer frame compared to the aluminum alloy frame on the Stacatto. The G48 is 7.28 inches long, 1.10 inches wide, 5.04 inches high, and weighs in at 20.74 ounces. The Stacatto C is 7.44 inches long, 4.94 inches high, 1.07 inches wide, and weighs in at 26.6 ounces. The Glock has a slightly longer barrel at 4.17 inches with the Glock Marksman barrel. However, the STI Stacatto has a 3.9-inch bull barrel that weighs in at a hefty 4.9 ounces compared to 2.9 ounces on the Glock. Our 2 ounces might not sound like much, but in terms of recoil, that actually can be a huge difference. At about 6 ounces heavier, the Stacatto C is the heavier firearm, which, that has some positives and negatives, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Now, the slides on both firearms are coated with a diamond-like coating, and they both have serrations that are forward and aft on the slide. Serrations on the Stacatto are obviously a little nicer. They have a little more time, and that's one of the areas where that extra money goes. But nonetheless, the serrations on the Glock are more than functional and perfectly adequate. Now, before we talk about things like the trigger and some other differences in the firearms, I thought it'd be nice to show the videos that inspired this video. Now, I was chronographing some ammo through the Stacatto, and on a whim I decided to also bring the Glock 48 to see, well, if there was any difference in the velocity. Well, let's see how that turned out. 12-12. 12-29, 12-32, 12-56, 12-76, and I destroyed the chronograph.
Do it.
$12.25. 11.18. 11.43. 11:38, 11:08, 11:31, 11:04. Off camera, we did test Sierra Outdoor Master 115 grain, as well as some Winchester Silvertip ammo, and the results were consistent between the two firearms, such that when doing velocity tests, I think one could stand in for the other in that regard. Now, one thing both these firearms have in common is they both have triggers. However, those triggers are worlds apart. The Glock G48 has the safe action trigger, which most Glocks have these days. Now, I believe Glock says these are set around 5.4 pounds. Off my gauge, this one actually came in at 3 pounds 4 ounces. I'm not a fan of the Glock safe action trigger, but I don't hate it. If I had to describe it, I would describe it in one word, and that word would be functional. Now, in general, this safe action trigger, combined with a grip angle, with the bore axis of the pistol, the sight picture of it, and the sights that come with it, things like that. Well, I'm not a fan of things like the ergonomics of most Glock pistols, or even the aesthetics of most Glock pistols. They actually end up being pistols that I find very shootable for me, which I think is the most important, thing to consider. The trigger on the Stacatto C is a single action only 1911 style trigger. Off my gauge, that came in at 4 pounds 9 ounces. Now, if you're looking just at numbers, you would say 4 pounds 9 ounces sounds terrible compared to 3 pounds 4 ounces. And while those numbers are vastly, different, there's a different story at play here. The Stacatto could have a much lighter trigger. However, I believe it is set where it is because it is intended to be a carry gun, not a competition gun. Now, the more important thing to keep in mind besides that is there's no take-up on the trigger. The break is very clean, crisp, has a very short trigger pull and a very short reset, which all these things combined make it a very quick, very shootable trigger that it does not take as much effort as what 4.9 pounds says on the paper. Now, on the flip side, the trigger on the Glock G48 at 3 pounds 4 ounces, that sounds like a very light trigger, but you have the length of the trigger pull, the shoe horn, the various ergonomics and things like that, to where it actually feels heavier than that to me. Now, it doesn't feel outrageous, it doesn't feel bad, but when I saw the numbers come off the gauge, I was like, wow, really that light? I thought it would be more like 5.5 pounds, something like that. But again, that's just numbers on a page. In terms of use, there's a longer trigger pull, a longer reset. Now, I don't think it's muddy or mushy or things like that you sometimes see triggers described as. But in terms of, the length of the trigger pull, the length of the reset, things like that, theoretically, something like the Stacatto, you could probably fire faster. Now, of course, you have the ammo capacity difference to consider in that regard, but still, there's some differences, and, there's going to be, a 1911 trigger is not the same as a safe action trigger. There's definitely a big difference in that regard, though they're both very shootable triggers. How about a little more range time before we talk about another talking point? A little low, it looks like. weight is another area where these firearms are, pretty different. With a 6-ounce weight difference, depending on how you look at things, you could say the lighter pistol is easier to carry, or that the heavier pistol is going to absorb recoil and be easier to shoot in that regard. Now, in my experience, I do believe that if we're talking two guns of almost identical dimensions, the lighter of the two guns is easier on the human as far as carryability goes. Now, as far as recoil and shootability, I thought a good test of that would be one-handed shooting, and I saved that for later in the day when my hands and arms were more fatigued, because, well, you're not going to be able to shoot, say, in ideal situations all the time. So let's see how that went. I think the results of that were very interesting. At the range, shooting that when I couldn't really see every round hit, I thought the Stacatto won. Though, looking back, watching it on camera, I think the Glock won, and I think it wasn't close. And one of the things you don't see in that video is, because the Glock 48 is lighter, after loading hundreds of rounds in magazines and shooting hundreds of rounds that morning before doing this test, I could hold the Glock 48 a lot more steady, one-handed, versus the Stacatto. Now, 6 ounces doesn't sound like much, but held out when you're trying to look and pinpoint aim, that's just enough to make you just slightly unsteady. And 10 yards away, a fraction of a change in your sight one way or the other, that changes you, inches or feet one way or the other. Now, in my normal two-hand grip, that's something that really is not apparent, because using the two hands you can sort of overcome that fatigue and maintain stability. Whereas with that one-handed grip, that extra fatigue and strain, really after an hour of shooting and loading magazines, becomes much more apparent. Now, how about we mix things up? Let's push the targets out to 15 yards and shoot our 8-inch round circle targets, and then we'll also test a couple different types of defensive ammo for accuracy and reliability. Not good. The first ammo we're going to test here is Federal Punch, some new ammo they have. This is the 124 grain 9mm jacketed hollow point ammo in this clip. I paused here because I'm curious to hear others' thoughts on it. Yesterday I was also testing, not on camera, again, some of the Federal Punch in 22, which I've shot 3 boxes of now. And all three I've just had terrible reliability out of. And then in this Federal Punch, first one, boom, failure. So I'm curious to hear others' experience with it. The other carry ammo we try is the Hornady Critical Defense 115 grain.
That's not good. And a failure. It's like the first failure ever out of the gun. Okay, gun fired that time. Okay, because we had a failure on the first side. Let's see how it does out of the.
When we move out to 15 yards, and especially when we shrink the size of the target, I think that's where things like the difference in sights and trigger and how that affects my performance with the firearm becomes more apparent. Now, I don't think I shot the Glock 48 bad, but I do think, at least in their current setup and how often that I shoot them, that as the range gets farther, I shoot the Stacatto with a higher degree of accuracy and precision than I do with the Glock 48. This last target would be a good example. 7 of 8 on the 6-inch target, one touching the bullseye at 15 yards using what I would call my standard defense ammo, the Hornady Critical Defense. For me, it's hard to complain about those results. That doesn't mean the Glock didn't have its moments. I think it certainly showed up well, especially in the one-handed shooting. As far as one-handed shooting goes, I think the Glock 48 might be one of, if not the best 9mm for me in that regard. If we ignore price for a moment, I think this ended up being a pretty fair comparison. Both firearms are just about identical in size. Glock has a 2-round advantage. Stacatto has some, we'll say, gunsmithing advantages. Things like a little better sights, a little better trigger, better, more functional slide serrations, though the ones on the Glock are certainly functional in their own right. But all told, we can't just ignore price. And on one half of this, price is a pretty big one. The stores I bought these at, this Glock 48 new runs around $499. Stacatto C 2011 runs around $1,800. Now, one thing I didn't mention is the optics ready nature of the firearms. The Stacatto C is optics ready by virtue of the Dawson sight system that it has. The Glock 48, when I bought it, it did not have an optics ready version, though now it does have an optics ready version, which that would be the one I would buy if I was buying this firearm. As a result, I'm considering it a wash in that regard. Now, there are times when you buy a firearm or any item and you wonder, does the price difference between object B, really make a difference or amount to anything? Now, on this Stacatto C, in my opinion, do you get something for that extra price? Yes. I think that definitive answer is yes. A lot of that extra money, in my opinion, goes to attention to detail. Things like an excellent factory trigger. It's excellent. Even though it's at, 5 pounds, we'll say, that's 5 pounds because this is a defensive carry gun, not because they didn't know what they were doing. They could very easily put it at, say, 1.5 pounds if they wanted to, if this was a competition gun. Let's zoom in on the slide serrations on this firearm And you can see that there's a lot of time and effort that went into not only putting those in place, but making sure that they would work and help you do the thing they were designed to do better, which is manipulate that slide. That is some beautiful work on there. That's where, part of where that money goes. There are times when you buy something where you're paying just for a name, and thus far in my experience with this Stacatto, you're actually getting value with every dollar you spend, and it's not just in, say, a name recognition or lack thereof. And at the same time, with the Glock G48 at that $499 price point, you're not just paying for a name. You're getting an accurate, reliable, very functional, very capable firearm. It's going to be very good in my experience. Now, some people are going to instantly dismiss it for only having a single stack 10 round capacity when you can get a bunch of different double stack 9mm options in Glock to this day. But I think there is certainly a market out there for people like myself who actually prefer the size of this single stack option. I've had a few different of the double stack 9mm Glocks over the years, and while they've shot and performed flawlessly for me, as far as my comfort and my shootability goes, I actually prefer this Glock 48 over something like the Glock 26 that I had most recently in 9mm before it. Now overall, I would say while this footage has shown us that the Stacatto is certainly a very capable, accurate, and reliable firearm, that it's also an expensive firearm, and that if the Glock 48 is what you can afford, or it's just what you want, that it's certainly plenty capable enough to compete as far as what they're designed to do, which is be a defensive pistol. Now, for me, is the Stacatto a little more accurate? Yes. But does that mean that the Glock 48 isn't reliable enough? No. I think the Glock 48 is actually very reliable in its own regard, and certainly reliable enough to get the job done, in my opinion. So while in some areas, some people might say this wasn't the most fair comparison, I'll say if nothing else, this certainly was a fun comparison. Well, I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching, and as always, have a good day.